Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man walah wa ba'd. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa fa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna 'ilman ya rabbil alameen. O Allah, teach us what will benefit us and benefit us with what you've taught us and increase us in knowledge and action, O Lord of the world. Today, I wanted to discuss with you the epistemological background or the foundations of cryptocurrencies, meaning how do we know what Islamic law says about something like cryptocurrencies. However, beforehand, I think it's important that I thank you, the people that are here for this conference, and specifically the organizers, because without the organizers, we all wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be participating, attending. We wouldn't be discussing. So thank you to Al-Barakah Bank and to the Association of Muslim Accountants and Lawyers. And thank you to the people of Durban, South Africa, which I do hope to visit one day. I've always had hopes of visiting South Africa, and I do hope to come and see you all possibly soon. Who knows? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man lam yashkur nas, lam yashkurillah." Whoever doesn't show gratitude to people has not showed gratitude to Allah. So I want to thank you, all of you, for being here today, for listening, and for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be able to go over these issues. Next, I wanted to touch on a point that I don't think is stressed enough, and that is the idea, the importance of technology, the importance of beneficial science, the importance of engaging with the modern world, engaging with the world. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, أَحَبُّ النَّاسِ إِلَى اللَّهِ أَنْفَعُهُمْ. The most beloved people to Allah are the most beneficial to others. And commenting on this, scholars have said that the most beneficial disciplines after the religious disciplines, which heal the soul, which care for the soul, are the medical disciplines, which heal the body, care for the body, and the engineering disciplines, which heal the environment that one lives in. And we as Muslims, we have a responsibility to be stewards for what we've been given. Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. I'm placing in this earth a steward. Alternate translation that what you might have heard, but I am placing in this earth a steward, generation after generation, who will be entrusted to take care of the earth. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna hadihi dunya hulwatun khadira, wa inna Allah mustakhlifakum fiha fayanzura kayfa ta'malun." This world is green and sweet. It's verdant and sweet, and God has placed you as stewards therein to see how you will act. So it's important that we steward not just our physical environments, not just our health, not just our religious sensibilities and our spirituality and our emotions, but we also steward our finances. And we look to those things which are going to be most beneficial, most efficient, that are going to increase access to equitable means of buying and spending and investing and earning and paying and so on and so forth, and decrease the ones which are harmful. And I think that it's important that I touch on a quick point here, and that is that when we talk about building equitable, fair systems of finance, we many times think of finance as existing in a bubble. We think that finance is this magical world of numbers where nothing matters except for how you calculate it and how the flow of funds works. And what we forget is that financial systems stem from political systems, and political systems stem from normative values which are held by the people that make up those political systems. So, if you have corrupt normative values, you will have corrupt politics and you will have corrupt financial systems. And it is upon us to not only democratize access to banking and finance, but to also absolve banking and finance of those very harmful, very detrimental elements that are reflected in the normative values which allow for usurpation, misappropriation, zero-sum outcomes in finance, things which are not win-win. And once we can realize that our normative values should affect our economies, should affect our financial systems, we will then inherently start to see a more fair and equitable financial system. And This fits in with the concept of cryptocurrencies because the use of blockchain and cryptocurrencies is all about decentralizing the regulation of currencies, the free flow of funds, allowing people the freedom of their capital. And for those of you familiar with Islamic studies, you will know that there are certain prohibitions about what is called sahib al-meks, or the person who curtails the free flow of assets and capital and investments by basically acting as a gatekeeper for money and things like that coming in. And this person, was a problematic person in the prophetic literature. So the idea of freeing up funds is important, to be free flow of funds is important, but there's also the importance of regulating it in a sense where everyone not only has access to those funds, but they can be sure that they're not being defrauded and that they are still being able to, that they're still, or that they are able to retain the value that they put into those funds. And that's a whole nother topic. Let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin, about cryptocurrencies. Obviously, Bitcoin is the what everybody talks about because simply it was everyone knew the term Bitcoin early on. But let's just say cryptocurrencies from now on. You'll hear a lot about people saying cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin is halal, Bitcoin is haram. There's a lot of discussion about it. Guess what? This has been the norm throughout Islamic history. Don't think that the variance of opinion on a particular subject, specifically a subject that is so fresh, like the use of blockchain in finance for the transfer of value, the creation of currency, don't think that is somehow an inherent weakness in Islamic law. It's not. It's a strength. Do you know why? Because that means that the idea of improving our financial systems through technology is not being rejected dogmatically. It's being dealt with by some people who are allowing it, some people who are not, some people who are trying to just ascertain how this stuff works. And this has happened many times throughout Islamic history. For example, tobacco, when it first came to the Muslim world, some people said you actually should smoke cigarettes because it gives you energy. You can stand in light in prayer longer. Others said, no, it's smelly. We don't know if it's harming anyone, but it's smelly and we shouldn't smell bad. Therefore, it should be avoided. It's impermissible. And then later on, as science progressed and studies progressed, almost scholars, almost all of them would say that it's impermissible because you're simply poisoning yourself. So they went through this process of variance of opinion. It happened with tobacco. It happened with coffee. It happened with a lot of different things. So we should never say, oh my gosh, all these scholars of Islam are disagreeing. That's actually a very, very healthy feature of Islamic law, that it is alive and that people are concerned about these things and that they are discussing it. Now, one thing has to be said, and that is that many of the fatwa that came out underneath the auspices of religious organizations or institutions which are government controlled. And in centralized governments, authoritarian governments, they are obviously going to be apprehensive, if I can use that very polite term, to something which is going to sap value out of the country and take the control of currency out of their hands. So we do have to read fatwa in their cultural and political contexts as well. So it's very healthy that we have differences of opinion between scholars, and it just means that we're still going through the process. And I am happy to be here today to talk to you a little bit about that process. So, a lot of times we ask the question, is crypto permissible? And this is the wrong question that we should be asking, because Islamically, everything is allowed until it is proven to not be allowed. So when we come across a new technology, we should not say, is this permissible? But we should say to ourselves instead, what are the parameters for the use of this thing? Number one, what is the reality of this thing that we're analyzing? And number two, what are the parameters for using that? So What is the reality of it? Scholars would say, al-hukm ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. To opine on something is based upon your conceptualization of it. So number one, we have to understand the underlying technology and functions. So if a person has trouble abstracting and understanding how a currency can exist in the cloud and not exist in a physical form, don't expect for them to understand what crypto is and how it works. Or a decentralized ledger doesn't mean that the parties are anonymous or unknown. Don't expect for them to understand or to say that it's permissible, because the conceptualization of those issues is still an issue with that one person. But as we raise awareness about how things work, then opinions can change. Now, people that would say, is crypto permissible, are the flip side of the people that would say that gold and silver are obligatory to use as currency. And both of these approaches posit some idea that Islamic law speaks to individual legal evidences for particular points in order for things to be legitimate. And this is not the case. Islamic law speaks in general precepts of how and why certain situations and certain things are permissible. Everything is permitted unless evidence shows otherwise, is the principle. And so we should say, what are the parameters that regulate our use of cryptocurrencies, and not fall into the dogmatism of thinking that we're going to open the Quran and find a verse about crypto. And unfortunately, that's how many people think of it, abusing this idea of what is permissible, what is halal, and what is haram. So how do we characterize cryptocurrencies under Islamic law? There's been several attempts. Some people have said that they are intellectual property rights. Some people have said they are merely digital assets. Others have said that they are weak currencies. And others have said that they're currencies like any other currencies. In reality, the last two opinions, not too much difference between them. It merely has to do with the distribution and use of those currencies. So if someone were to say that Bitcoin or crypto is allowed because it's an intellectual property right, I'm going to be honest with you. This opinion is very weak. And the reason why it's weak is because something being an intellectual property right does not confer a legal status in and of itself. I can have the intellectual property right to something which is unequivocally impermissible. I can have the intellectual property rights, own them to something that, God forbid any of us fall into this, but someone could own the property rights to adult entertainment. They have the intellectual property rights to a story about, murder or something like that. That doesn't necessarily mean that in and of itself that confers on it the status of being permissible. So another point is that IP is it cannot, in and of itself, intellectual property cannot be so ubiquitous so that there's no difference between it and other things which are like it. It's like me saying I have the intellectual property to the statement Durban is a city in South Africa. That's a statement that everybody knows, and there's nothing which is original about that statement. It's not a unique expression, and it's not fixed in a permanent state. So the idea that crypto is an intellectual property right just doesn't really sit well with the nature of cryptocurrencies in and of itself. Especially being a fixed, for an intellectual property right to be valid, it has to be in a fixed state, and a decentralized ledger would seem to belie that point. So let's talk a little bit more about the idea of digital assets versus actual currencies. When we talk about currencies, we have to differentiate between a few things. Number one, we have to talk about the substance of a currency. So any currency at its heart has no substance. It may be an asset, may be backed by an asset, it may be not. But in and of itself, nothing really matters. People say, well, what about gold and silver? Well, guess what? Gold and silver traditionally have not always been accepted as currency. In some societies, they were thrown to the side, and salt was used instead, or seashells was used instead. So fish bladders were used instead. So gold and silver do not have an intrinsic value, although they are very popular currency. So that substance currency does not have a substance in and of itself, but it does have certain characteristics and functions. What are those characteristics and those functions? Well, the function is that crypto is used as a currency in a limited sense. It may not be accepted by all markets and all vendors, and that's why we can characterize it as a weak currency. But how is it different than other digital assets? Many of you probably use the internet, you know of WordPress, or maybe you've downloaded Microsoft Word or something like that from the internet. Those are digital assets. Those are things that we get from the internet. Well, what's the difference between me owning a unit of crypto and me owning a unit of, or me owning a WordPress plugin? Well, the only thing I use the crypto for is the transfer and storage of value. The WordPress plugin has a function and an ability in and of itself that it provides that is unique to it, whereas a unit of cryptocurrency does not. It is fungible, and the only function that it has is to transfer value to one party from another. So when we look at the history of Islamic law, we find that when fiat currencies and floating currencies became ubiquitous throughout the world, and after the time of Nixon, when the dollar was floated, and a lot of currencies stopped becoming backed by the dollar, which was backed by gold, and again pointing back to political systems and normative values. Scholars said, okay, well, we would say that people used gold and silver because they thought of them as having value, possessing thamaniya, or ghalabat al-thamaniya, predominant value. Well, now these paper currencies don't have any value, or they don't have any intrinsic value, or intrinsic value. So how do we characterize them? Do we still characterize them as currency? Well, yes, we do, because people accept them as units of measure, as stores of value, and they themselves trade them in that sense and use them like we used to use gold and silver. So the predominant, and I would say the vast majority, if not all, of modern scholars had said that fiat currencies, which were issued by central banks, were considered to be currencies like any other currency that preceded them, simply because of the value which they were imparted with. And that meant that we could then not trade those values for asynchronous amounts. So I could not trade 1 Egyptian pound, 1 guinea, for 2 Egyptian pounds, 2 guinea. Why? Because I have a asynchronous, an unmatched amount of value that is there. And so in one sense, it's a win-lose situation, because someone's losing an extra unit of measure. Cryptocurrency is very much like fiat currency in that it is a storage of value and a method for transferring it. And were it not for that cryptocurrency would not exist. And because of that, because of how it does not have an intrinsic value of its own, it doesn't have an intrinsic function of its own, its only characteristic is to store value and transfer it, then the most fitting analogy for it is that it is a currency. Now, some people come and they say, well, early fiat currencies actually were made out of copper, and scholars allowed the trade of 2 copper coins for 1 copper coin at times. And why did they do that? Well, the reason that they did that is because those fiat currencies, when they were minted in non-precious metals like copper and zinc and nickel and things like that, they also were purer metals, and so they could be traded for their weights. And because the base alloy or the base metal had a value in and of itself, it actually had an intrinsic value. It wasn't simply extrinsic. But now that we're dealing with currencies which have a purely extrinsic value, meaning that they have nothing underneath that shows them value, or that gives them value other than the fact that I consider it to have value and to transfer value, then we must take value as the key reason for considering it a currency. What does that mean? That means that units of cryptocurrency or any currency are fungible, and the rules of loans still apply to them. And this is something that even if you were to consider crypto a digital asset, Islamic law dictates that even when you loan a simple loan of an asset, or an asset loan, which is fungible, you are still not allowed to do a 2-for-1 trade. So if I loan you a cup of sugar, I can't ask for 2 cups of sugar in back. Otherwise, that is considered riba. It's considered interest, because I'm taking more than the value which was given to me. Now, if I traded you 1 cup of sugar for 2 cups of wheat, that'd be completely fine. So even if we say it's a digital asset, it really does nothing to affect how we would trade it equitably according to the rules of Islamic law. And other people will make arguments about clean versus tainted crypto and how this somehow affects the fungibility. But that's like saying a dollar bill with dirt on it is different than a dollar bill that is clean. They're still acceptable at the bank for the same amount of value. They don't change in any sense or any form. And none of us would rightfully or rationally accept that somebody gave us 2 old dirty dollars for 1 clean crisp dollar, because whenever we go to the bank, the value is going to be the same. Whenever we trade with people and buy with people, the value is going to be the same. And so why would we defraud ourselves of that value, or disenfranchise ourselves of that value? Now, Ibn Qudama mentions a silent consensus that he relates. He says that everything in which riba al-fadl, which is the interest of there being asynchronous amounts, then riba nasi'a, there being deferred interest, which is accrued interest that is earned in the future, is forbidden as well, without any difference that we know of. Now, to conclude, when we talk about why something is a currency, we have to look at, number 1, the reality of that thing. Number 2, its proximity to similar cases and items in both the Islamic text as well as the history of Islamic law. And we find that currencies in their general form, as long as they store value and transfer value in our a unit of measure, are permissible. That when they are considered to be currencies and used between people, then they have to be subject to the laws of Islamic currency trade, which means that you have to have equal amounts of the same currency, and you can have differing amounts of different currencies. $2 for 1 Bitcoin, 2 Bitcoins for 1 Litecoin, 1 Litecoin for 2 of Verge, whatever. But you can't do 2 of Verge for 2 of Verge, or 2 of, one unit of Verge for 2 units of Verge. That wouldn't be permissible. Why? Because you would be taking more than you had given of the same value. So that would be considered interest. So as long as you're following the rules of Islamic currency trade, which are spot transactions, which are of equal value of the same currency or varying values of different currencies, then it's completely fine to buy, sell, purchase, trade. And yes, even mind, with the caveat, however, that myself, I'm still doing some research about, proof of work or stake. Those things that have to do with mining, to me, need a little bit more research done, because the idea of seigniorage comes in, which is very similar to how fiat currencies are created. But to claim that cryptocurrencies are exempt from the rules of Islamic currency trade because they are intellectual property rights, or because they are digital digital assets, does seem weak, in my opinion, based on the nature and the function of these assets. So if one's going to use these cryptocurrencies, then they have to follow the rules of currency exchange under Islamic law. And I believe my time is up, so I would like to thank all of you again. Thank you for attending. Thank the organizers of Baraka Bank and the Association of Muslim Accountants and Lawyers. And thank you, Durban, South Africa. And I do hope to visit you one day. And if you would like to read more about this topic, you can go to my website and go to joebradford.net/crypto. and you will find a detailed article that talks about what we talked about today, and a few links to some other resources. Jazakhallah Khair, Assalamu Alaikum Rahmatullah.